I want to get 3 things out of the way. Firstly, I don't do horror. At all. Never really had an affinity for it. I hate the jump scares and tension that comes with it, and outside of a few exceptions, I tend to stay away from the genre as a whole. Secondly, even though I've played the original Nintendo DS version of this game on my main YouTube channel, I opted to try out the updated remastered version, which is the version of Dementium that I'm going to be reviewing. And lastly, this game Hospitalizing Me is a story in its own right. I'll get into that later. So anyway, what exactly is it about Dementium Remastered, the Nintendo 3DS version of Dementium the Ward on the Nintendo DS, that made me decide to play a horror title in the first place? And also, despite the testing horror, why I would still recommend it. Developed by Renegade Kid and released in late 2015, Dementium Remastered is a digital-only $15 Nintendo 3DS title, promising updated visuals, rebalanced difficulty, and a new Demented mode from the original 2007 Nintendo DS version. This mature title is one of the few first-person shooter titles on the now-retired handheld, and it's also one of the few horror titles on the handheld. Thank God. Originally, this game was pitched to be a Silent Hill game on the Nintendo DS, but after Konami turned it down, probably for the best, Renegade Kid made it into its own original title. The Nintendo 3DS and DS family of consoles emphasized the unique qualities of the platform by creating video games that made the most of its controls and limitations. Case in point, the touchscreen. If you were playing this game with a home console controller, odds are you would use the right analog stick to aim the reticle, but the touchscreen is how you'll be aiming, and if you tolerate the occasional need to recalibrate it, it does a more than adequate job of substituting camera and aiming controls. Switching between weapons is also rather easy to do on the touchscreen. When you're forced to let go of the flashlight to kill an enemy in darkness, the action pauses, allowing you to whip out a pistol or shotgun or buzzsaw. This game is a survival horror title, so you will want to conserve weapon ammunition, but as long as you're a good shot and know when to use melee weapons, you should only rarely run out of ammo. Of course, it helps to keep your cool too. This is a horror game after all. It will do everything in its power to scare you. Naturally, Nintendo 3DS graphics aren't the best of graphics as far as video games go. For Dementium Remastered, there's certainly an improvement to the Nintendo DS version, but as I'm about to explain, it's a double-edged sword for this game. The setting of Dementium Remastered is in a hospital, with several stories to it, meaning that the rooms will begin to feel rehashed after playing the game for an hour or two. The human animations in this game are adequate, but you may think they look too robotic or uncanny. The enemies in this game, well enough, do have a couple of palette swaps. Also, despite this game being a graphical improvement to its Nintendo DS counterpart, there is the occasional graphical hiccup. In my case, there was a door sign that floated in midair, and some health that I couldn't pick up. This game has its fair share of glitches apparently, but I didn't experience any noteworthy ones. And for all that I know, they've been long since mended with an update. On the upside, the horror in this game is very much genuine. You'll always be on guard when you see an enemy, and more so when you don't. Bloody rooms and destroyed furniture are strong catalysts in getting your feet cold, and the unnatural appearances of the enemies in this game will make your heart race, especially when playing Dementium Remastered with the 3D on. I'm suddenly thankful that I captured gameplay of this game with the new Nintendo 2DS. Yeah, you're definitely going to want to play this game while wearing headphones. They'll immerse you into the experience and make it easier for you to know where enemies are lurking. You'll also be able to pick up the occasional background noise that includes dragging metal, little girl sounds, groaning, alarms, buzzing, and heavy rain. The sound design for the enemies is rather well done, especially for one type of enemy. More on that later. Groaning, squelching, shrieking, and panting noises are what you'll pick up, and the only thing louder than the enemies are your weapons. That being said, the machine gun sounds a bit off, honestly, and the pistol and magnum weapons reload with similar sound effects, but the buzzsaw sounds just right, especially against one type of enemy. The music in this game is, for the most part, simple piano melodies and one-note pseudo-vocalizations, about as stereotypical as you can get for horror, but effective nevertheless. And there's always a heartbeat during gameplay, which you're perfectly capable of turning off in the options menu. Why would you want to, unless you want to die? It's like not wearing a face mask in public during this COVID-19 pandemic. The mostly visual-based story that Dementium Remastered tells is of a tale of a man named William Redmore who was staying at Redmore Hospital. The first thing that you see is yourself strapped to a wheelchair and wait, what's going on? Why is there blood on the ground? Oh god, is she dead? Is she alright? Are they alright? Who are you? Ah! From here, you pick up a notebook and a flashlight. It's self-explanatory what they're for. For some reason, the sentence, "Why did you do it?" is scribbled on one of the pages, implying that you've committed some sort of crime. You'll eventually make your introduction to the first boss of this game, a hulking stitched scrotum called the Cleaver, who's about to fillet a bitch. After he's dealt with, you're able to step outside for some fresh air, only to see that same lady get abducted by the doctor fillet you've seen before. For whatever reason, there's a church in this hospital. I seriously doubt that God would forgive you for what's been going on here. Regardless of that, you must get 3 pieces of a picture that'll shed some light on you and your backstory. An encounter with a wheelchair patient with a Gatling gun for a right arm, and a bizarre room with giant mouths, alongside a few relatively simple puzzles later, you should have located the remaining pieces of the picture. It depicts the little girl that is your daughter, the woman that is your wife, and you. But why is your face scratched off? Between here and the final encounter with the doctor, you fight both the Cleaver and the wheelchair patient. Once at the basement, one of the few areas in the game where you don't need the flashlight to see, you have a final showdown with the bad doctor himself. Boom! Headshot! Once victorious, everything goes white, and you have a vision of your wife and daughter. But it turns out you're undergoing brain surgery, and the events that occur in this game most likely were in your head.
Let the record show that as of 3:33 a.m., the patient has survived phase 1 of the operation. Prepare for phase 2.
You will encounter these enemies during your misadventures in the hospital. Rather than list them in their order of appearance, I'll be listing them in their fear factor. And by fear factor, I mean how effectively they might be in terrorizing the player. Not the show, mind you. That got itself cancelled by showing sexy ladies drinking donkey sperm. There are 2 types of small insects in Dementium Remastered, roaches and flying insects. The former scatter when you shine a light onto them, and the latter are drawn to it. They deal relatively light damage, but you should still avoid them. You can't really shoot or cut them anyway. Malukas are worm-like slugs that sound like crying babies in need of an abortion. There are also green worms, which are twice as strong and twice as resilient. If you don't see them coming out of vents, feel free to kill them. Otherwise, just run from them to conserve health and ammunition. Chest walls are the first type of enemies you see. They're the closest thing to human in this game, but they're clearly not, as they've all apparently woken up from open heart surgery. They can run towards you, spit acid at you from a short distance, and swing away at you if they get close. They can even play dead, which honestly makes them easy targets if you don't give them the opportunity to get up and retaliate. Crawlers have no legs, and no skin apparently. You'll usually hear them seconds before seeing them. I find the machine gun to work best on them because, just like the chest moths, they too spit at you. Banshees are... unholy screeching abominations. The beheaded seeds of Satan defy gravity and normally roam about the skywalks of the hospital until halfway into the game, where they start to appear inside of the hospital. Once they spot you, they fly straight towards you and attempt to impale you with their spear-like tongues. In the last few chapters of this game, you can easily get to your Tootsie Pop Center with only a few licks. Whichever of the 5 or so people that worked on this game had the idea to create these monstrosities, I hope they get a raise in this world and have a reservation in hell in the next world. Yeah, it's safe to say that the Banshees are everyone's scariest enemy in this game. So it is true that this game hospitalized me, but it was the original Nintendo DS version that did so, and it didn't exactly directly hospitalize me. Otherwise there'd be a few video game news articles about it. No, it was actually coincidental how this game hospitalized me. I played the original Nintendo DS version when I was 17 years old, and I distinctly remember just beating the wheelchair boss before I felt a growing pain on the left side of my chest, which amplified whenever I breathed and when I lied down or bent over. Basically, I was hospitalized for 5 days for a spontaneous pneumothorax, and I still played the game in the hospital, but I focused much more on The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass and Solana Robo Red the Hunter during my stay. Something to note about Dementium Remastered is that it received lower review scores than Dementium the Ward. Even though they're technically the same game, it's most likely that, at the time of the Nintendo DS, Dementium the Ward was seen as one of the most technically and visually impressive video games on the little handheld. Not too many Nintendo DS titles were full 3D. They were usually 2D or 2.5D, with sprites and fixed perspectives. The Nintendo DS titles that were in full 3D, while the graphics are certainly dated by today's standards, were a delight to experience, and despite my stance on horror, Dementium the Ward was certainly a pleasure to play through. That's why, after playing Dementium Remastered, I would still recommend the original version, but only by a slim margin. Yes, the original version has enemies that respawn, doesn't have save points in between chapters, and it doesn't have Demented mode, which I can only imagine is the equivalent of Minecraft's hardcore mode. But the original version, to be honest, isn't as graphically inferior as the remastered version would make you think. And the sound isn't exactly reworked either. It's almost like telling the difference between the Legend of Zelda games that are on last-gen and current-gen platforms. Ultimately, you're paying $15 for a 4-hour game that you might not find too much joy in replaying, or significantly more than retail price for a complete in-box Nintendo DS version. To me, who owns both versions, that price point is adequate. But based on content and maturity alone, I would find it difficult to recommend this title. If you do give it a chance, you will definitely be sucked into the tension and uneasiness that this game is going for. Whether you set aside how clunky the controls might be, or how repetitive the environments eventually become, is up to you.
Malatesta, I bring you an offering. Do with him what you will.